Deathpixie disclaimer. This video was originally recorded in September 2024. There is swearing and profanity. Sources are listed in the description. This video is not monetized. Any ads you see provide revenue to the hosting site, not the creators. If you made it this far, geez, you have a lot of patience.
Dance Pixie, dancing on the lip of madness!
Welcome to Shitty PowerPoint Theater. Dignity not included.
So we get to John G. Diefenbaker, or the Dief.
The Dief.
He was an asshole, a raging asshole. He was an anti-racist asshole, though. But he was still an asshole. He kind of turned from these like witty quips that people would make to outright attacks on you.
Oh, yeah. Oh.
So it was dispensing with all pleasantries. I am going to attack you, which I will admit isn't as
he would have won the shade. He would have won shade. He really would have won shade, because the amounts that he makes are cutting. But it got to the point where, you know, you don't even look at it as political anymore, politically motivated. No, these can get downright personal and downright nasty. He is pathetically bad at being a human.
Yeah. So, he was a progressive conservative. We're seeing a transformation here. We had the Conservative Party. It became the Progressive Conservative Party later. There's a lot of complications. We're not going into that. He had his first wife, Edna Brower, and his second wife, Olive Palmer. He outlived both of his wives, and apparently actually became nastier after his second wife died. So yeah, that's the Dief. As you can tell, I have his infamous pointing finger, because there's a very famous photograph of him pointing to his opponents across. He made things personal. So there you go. He appointed the first female minister in Canadian history to his cabinet. That was Ellen Faircloth. He also appointed the first Indigenous member of Senate. That was James Gladstone. He obtained passage of the Canadian Bill of Rights. So you're seeing him carrying over the work being done prior to him. In 1960, First Nations women and men are able to vote no matter where they live and without giving up their Indian status. So this granted the vote to the First Nations and Inuit people. He eliminated racial discrimination in immigration policy. And actually, this policy was built upon later with Pearson. So it didn't necessarily pass here, but it was built upon from Pearson. He recommended the appointment of the first French-Canadian Governor General, which was Georges Vanier. And his stance on apartheid is actually, quite frankly, probably his legacy piece. So the big thing about that was it is wildly recognized that his most important contribution was his stance on apartheid. So there was a conference of the Commonwealth where Baroda formally applied for South Africa to remain in the Commonwealth. The prime ministers, who were all members of the different Commonwealth nations, were divided, and Diefenbaker actually broke that deadlock by proposing that South Africa only be readmitted if it joins the other states in condemning apartheid in principle. Once it became clear that South Africa's membership would be rejected, Verwoerd withdrew his country's application to remain in the Commonwealth and left the group. So that actually forced Britain to take a stance on apartheid. And so that him breaking the deadlock, forcing everybody to come together against apartheid, and then that had a factor of forcing Britain to now have a stance on apartheid, did in fact eventually lead to the actions that we saw in the abolition of apartheid in South Africa. So that is really his legacy piece. So I will give that to him. Like I said, an asshole, but an anti-racist asshole. Big con was cancellation of the Aero project. This, I believe it could have actually put Canada on the map for aviation. Then it was canceled. We won't go into that. He approved plans to join the United States in what became known as NORAD, but he did this without consulting cabinet or parliament. That's a big no-no in a lot of Canadian politics. This is the big one. He had major indecision on whether or not to accept bombardic nuclear missiles from the United States. That led to his government's downfall. Look, nobody wants to accept nuclear missiles. I freaking get it. But guess what? You're in a position where you have to make a decision. You have to make it now. Also, President Kennedy openly did not like Diefenbaker and openly would ignore him for preference for the leader of the opposition, who was Pearson at the time. So it's one of those things where I'm like, Kennedy was also an asshole getting involved in Canadian politics. He rapidly passed legislation, including tax cuts and increases in old age pensions, but the lower taxes were not balanced, so that creates a problem later on. There was an economic downturn due to tax cuts implemented the previous year. Typically, deficits are viewed as a bad thing. It can go either way. The Bank of Canada was forced to devalue the Canadian dollar, and that's typically viewed as a bad thing. I will note that this is where we're starting to see the 60s scoop happen. So as residential schools go out, we are beginning to see the 60s scoop, which is child welfare authorities scooping up Indigenous children from their families and communities for placement in foster homes. This scoop actually began in the 50s, and it persisted into the 80s. And they were, if you look at the statistics, taken far more than they proportionally should have. So it was clearly targeted. He was very, very anti-racist. He actually spearheaded the CPs to one of their greatest triumphs, which was the 1958 Canadian election.
Yep.
When the Cuban Missile Crisis happened, Kennedy actually chose not to consult with Diefenbaker before making decisions on which action to take, and released a statement stating that it had Canada's full support when he never spoke to Canada. So that's what I mean when I say Kennedy was also an asshole to Diefenbaker. There's a two-way street. It should be noted that there are instances of Diefenbaker lying in his memoir, where like talking about things that never occurred. So there's a bit of that going on. He does recall that he saw injustice firsthand in his youth against French Canadians, Indigenous Canadians, and Métis. He said, "From my earliest days, I knew the meaning of discrimination. Many Canadians were virtually second-hand citizens because of their names and racial origin. Indeed, it seemed until the end of World War II that only first-class Canadians were either of English or French descent. As a youth, I determined to devote myself to assuring that all Canadians, whatever their racial origin, were equal, and declared myself to be a sworn enemy of discrimination." A show of what I mean in terms of his attitude. Pearson died of cancer in 1972. Diefenbaker was asked if he had any kind words for his old rival. And Diefenbaker shook his head and said he shouldn't have won the Nobel Prize. Like, you couldn't have said one nice thing. I'm kicking myself for not having this, but there is a quote about him. Well, that was said to him. What is the difference between a cactus and a conservative cactus?
I don't know. What?
On a cactus, the pricks are on the outside. Pierre Elliott Trudeau said, Canada has finally produced a prime minister worthy of assassination. So, you know, that tells you about him in terms of relating to people. He went to the University of Saskatchewan. He actually served in World War I. He was a noted criminal defense lawyer. In his first year of practice, he did 62 jury trials, winning approximately half of his cases. And he rarely called defense witnesses, thereby avoiding the possibility of a rebuttal witness for the Crown and securing the last word for himself. He went on to the village of Wakaw Council. Went to House of Commons. He actually contested elections constantly with little success until he finally got elected to the House of Commons. So he was fighting all the time. He was leader of the opposition, became prime minister, later leader of the opposition. He actually led the unsuccessful opposition to the maple leaf flag that we have. And I'm just like, of all the fights to pick, that's what you pick? All right, whatever. 2 officials of the Diefenbaker government had slept with a woman suspected of being a Soviet spy.
Always great.
Yeah, according to columnist Charles Lynch, Diefenbaker regarded Joe Clark, as an upstart and a pipsqueak. So, you know, there you go. They only get longer from here, man.
Yeah.
We're
Actually, it's been like a good 2 hours.
I know.
2.5 hours.
I know.
I think you're gonna need to split this episode, man.
Probably. But at this point, do you have anything you want to say about the Dief?
Okay. So I think I've already said what I need to say about the Dief, man. He was reportedly very anti-racist, but not a good person. And, I mean, there are times when you need those people, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he would have been remembered a lot more fondly had he been a nicer human being.
Yep, I will agree with that.
Because a lot of the things that he put in place that were good were very good. They were landmark pieces. The apartheid thing is a landmark. However, when you claim that your longtime political opponent should have never won his Nobel Peace Prize, Lester B. Pearson being a war hero,
Yeah.
Hey, this is Trapdoor Crabsworth for deathpixie. If you liked our content, please like this video and subscribe. And if you want to see more, just check out our links in the description. Do it. Do it or Miri will kill you.